And we are live here in the Storycraft Cafe. Thank you for joining us today. I am Hank Garner, your host, as always. Today, super excited to have Glynn Stewart joining us on the show. Glynn is the author of the Starships Mage series, which is how I discovered his work, and then have since discovered that Glynn authors so much more and has built this amazing universe of stories. And I'm super excited to talk about it today.
I have
Welcome.
lost track of how many series I've written.
That's a good problem to have, isn't it, Glynn? Glynn, I love to start the show by asking a fun question to kind of break the ice and to kind of get our writer brains working. And one thing that I love to ask people is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh God, first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller. One of those things where you kind of always told stories, wrote stories. The one that always sticks in my mind is I don't know when this was. It was very early grade school.
Yeah.
We had to do a creative writing experiment thing. And this was Canada. And I was a very strange child. So mine involved hockey skating mice with machine guns. I had some very concerned teachers because it was rather violent for, I think it would have been about 8.
Okay. That checks out. What happened with that story?
I think I got a good grade. I mean, it would have been 30 odd years ago now. So
so having written that story, did that kind of, start this itch of, I envisioned this thing. I saw it from beginning to end. This is maybe something I could continue
I
doing.
don't know if that was where the itch started or if I already had the itch because I never stopped writing after that. There's some cashier notebooks that hopefully no longer exist with some rather terrible 12-year-old Redwall fan fiction in it, that kind of thing. There's definitely some Star Wars fan fiction that got written in class when I was supposed to be doing other things, and that's long gone now too.
Yeah.
Well, I wrote my first novel when I was 17.
Yeah.
Might have been 16.
Okay.
I'll never see the light of day. Never.
And that's sort of a rite of passage, for writers, is that trunk novel, that desk drawer novel, whatever you want to call it. The thing that you go through the process,
right.
Figure it out.
I don't know. I don't necessarily believe there's an exact figure, like 1 million words of crap. But you have to write a lot to find your voice.
Yeah.
And once you've found your voice, a lot of other things kind of fall into place over time. But you have to write so much to become smooth. The quote I got somewhere, and this is apparently from a Marine drill sergeant, but by the time it came to me, it was about fourth hand. Slow is smooth, smooth is fast. So you do it slowly a lot until you get smooth at it. And then as you're smooth, without even realizing it, you get faster.
Okay.
But you start doing it slowly and carefully and smoothly.
Interesting.
And then you just do it more and more and more.
Yeah, I like that.
And then suddenly you have 7 million words or something published.
Right. You began your career as an accountant, is that right?
Yes. I am a chartered professional accountant in Canada. I did my professional hours in industry. I am not qualified to do audit, or there's a specific additional qualification I would need to be able to do. It's like hang out my shingle, as the term is, to do like audits and taxes and such.
Right.
But I am qualified still to write bank accepted financial statements for a corporation.
Okay. All right. And did you enjoy that work?
Yes, actually. I spent most of my time in industry in financial analysis. So what the heck was going on here? What do these numbers actually mean? What do we think is going to come up? Budgets, forecasting, convincing banks that our project was going to make enough money that they should lend us money to support it. Those kinds of things.
Yeah.
It was fun. It was complicated. It was a challenge. I missed some of it.
Yeah.
But not all of it.
I understand that. I love to to kind of pick apart what things have influenced our creative life. And I love that you were an accountant, and
Mhm.
because I'm convinced that whatever you go through in life, whatever career path you choose, whatever hobbies that you have, people that you meet, experiences you have, those all contribute tools to your toolbox as a
Everything goes
writer.
in the blender.
Everything goes in the blender, it goes in the toolbox that you can reach in and pull out from
Yeah.
time to time. What do you think you gained from that career path that now serves you well as a writer?
In some ways, a perspective.
Okay.
It's an interesting thing that you don't realize until you've been the realization that there are people behind everything. It was a fight
Right.
I had with a lot of subordinates and so forth in accounting, and I've occasionally had it since then. But no number is just a number.
Right.
Everything has people behind it. And but numbers are useful tools for describing things. And between that and an economic perspective, like it's really a lot. I try and factor through kind of what the economies of things mean and think about them from a business perspective and an economic perspective. Not necessarily an accounting perspective, but kind
Sure.
of the general perspective thought of how does this fit together from a commercial and enterprise perspective. And then that feeds into the setting building. And it's like, I tell people it's like story feeds technology, feeds setting, feeds store, and then it's a triangle of those three pieces. And
Right.
I do a lot of work in the economics side of setting and technology. Is like, how does this particular method of faster than light travel that we're hand waving together for this setting translate into what does their economy look like? What do their communications look like? Does this level of communication that I've given this setting allow for an interstellar economy at all? Or an interstellar government at all? Or if you're running an interstellar economy in this, how are you handling money when money as it exists in our current world is very much an electronic fiction of our instantaneous communication? I can go from Canada to Australia and I can access my bank account. If I go from Earth to a system that's 120 light years away and it's a 6 month communication turnaround, I can't access my bank account.
Right.
So you're back to that factors into your economics and your trade. And so you end up coming back to my other main hobby of history. And how was that handled back before we had the transatlantic telegraph cables and the phone cables and the internet? And, it's things like letters of credit. And you're basically carrying a piece of paper that says from your bank that says, we will pay up to $10,000 or whatever drawn on this person's account. If they will draw it from you and you will send us a letter with this and we will send you the money or the gold or whatever. And it ends up being the banks have this whole back and forth communication. But for the perspective of the person and the business, you need that letter that says, my bank says I have $10,000. And that's what a letter of credit originally was.
Right. That's
And so
that's
you end up,
interesting. That's I don't think that a lot of people would think of accounting and then be able to see how that affects people, groups of people, planets, countries. That it really does really put a new perspective on the ideas of numbers and accounting, and when you think of them as just representatives of people and relationships and that sort of thing.
I have an entire series that is basically a hate letter to the concept of Seldonian mathematics.
That's rather
Because as soon as you start trying to derive people down to numbers and
right.
removing the people from your decision, that is where a lot of very callous evil gets born.
Yeah.
And so when you look at something like the Seldonian math of the Foundation series, and it's, well, we can derive all of people and all of the future down to these calculations. Well, then you have someone like Barry Seldon in the Foundation who sits up and draws this very cold-blooded, absolutely ruthless, if you've read the Foundation books,
Yeah.
schema for restoring how he thought the universe should be. And so so I have a setting where you've got a group of people who are trying to do that, trying to arrange the galaxy in a way that they think is best for everyone, and shock, they're the bad guys.
Right. Glynn, I discovered your work because one of my sons-in-law and I were having a conversation, and we were talking about um, science fiction and kind of some of the direction of some of the newer science fiction, and how it was just I'm trying to think of a good word to describe this. Nihilistic in a lot of ways, and just not hopeful and not
Mm.
fun. Not fun. I grew
There
up
is.
in the I was a teenager in the 80s, and I remember a lot of the science fiction that I read, and some of this was stuff that I'd found that was published in, the 60s and 70s, and you bring up Foundation, and that's a seminal work for me
Mhm.
when I was beginning to read science
Same.
fiction and fantasy. And I while there were dark themes back then, um, in this kind of golden age of science fiction, there was a sense of adventure. It was fun, and it seems like lately there's been a lot of science fiction that's just not fun. It's just not, in the way that Star Wars was fun, in the
Mhm.
'70s when it first came out. And and of course there's lots of hand wavium that happens in Star Wars, but that's kind of part of the fun of it,
Yes.
the mixture of fantasy with sci-fi, and they're not having to be a deep treatise on how the jump to hyperspace works. It just works. It's created. We were having this conversation, and we said, well, let's find something that's modern, new, but still fun. And we
Mhm.
came across your Starships Mage series and fell into it. And I
Mhm.
loved it so much. I said, I've got to email Glynn and see if we can have a conversation on the show about it. What are your ideas about science fiction before we get into, this specific series and that, but what is it that you love about science fiction, and what was it that you felt was missing from science fiction that you and your voice could find a place?
Science fiction is about holding up a mirror to today. Like fundamentally, I am not trying to predict the future. I don't have any idea what's going to happen. I am something of a futurist just from my background in financial planning, but I am not trying to predict the future. I'm not trying to accurately guess what technology is going to be in the 23rd, 27th, 32nd century, whatever.
Sure.
I am trying to hold a mirror up to today, and mostly I'm just trying to entertain. Like most, I'm not going to pretend I'm one of the deep philosophers of our age. On the other hand, neither was William Shakespeare.
Right.
William Shakespeare was a pop fiction writer. He was writing his equivalent of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, let's not forget that part of the whole of
Right.
William Shakespeare and a lot of our other big classical names. Like, they weren't writing to be classics for the ages. They were writing paid by the word in a lot of cases.
Right. Exactly.
I don't necessarily think my stuff is going to rise to those levels, but I do point that out to myself on occasion. But but science fiction is about today, not about tomorrow. And so that's what makes looking at some older science fiction where they got tomorrow wrong. And it's like, yeah, they were always going to get tomorrow wrong. It's like when you're making a budget in business or whatever, it's wrong the moment you write it down. It's just that's the nature of the thing. You're predicting from your point in time.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to look at what's going on now, and from that draw extrapolations and paint the extrapolations on these massive canvases of grand adventures and epic and over the top villains and all of that. And at the end of the day, it's about having fun, and it's about maybe delivering some messages that have a meaning today. In my case, a lot of it is, to echoing Terry Pratchett, don't treat people as things you pricks.
Oh, the world is a much worse place that Sir Pratchett is not in it anymore.
This is very true.
Yeah, yeah. So you start writing Starships Mage. What was your initial idea? You know what I love to ask people is, at one point in time, a story like Starships Mage, and I'm assuming this just began as a book.
It's a short story.
A short story, and if I'm not mistaken, you originally published it as 5 novellas. Is that right?
So it was written as one short story that has been seen by about 5 people total, and will probably not be seen by more than that. That was expanded into a novella, which was episode 1 of Starships Mage. Then over the ensuing year, 2014, 10 years ago, God, I wrote the other 4 novellas, which I think the total was about 135,000 words for the 5 of them.
Okay.
Packaged that up as Starships Mage Book 1 in December of 2014. And then from there, a second book came along, and a third, and 15th.
Stick a pin in that for just a second, and let's rewind for just a second. Before the grand connected universe, before Starships Mage existed, there was a kernel of an idea that came to you in some form or fashion. And when this idea, maybe it was a character walked onto the stage of your mind, maybe it was the what if game that you started playing, and then at some point Starships Mage did exist, and then it was up to you as the writer to dig that out of the dirt, polish it up, work it into what it became, and then write the book. What was that first kernel of an idea, if you can remember?
TV tropes.
Okay.
So there is a trope on TV tropes of a wizard did it, which is usually applied to some sort of magical solution, but also applied occasionally to, we've got this high-tech fancy do-wizard that we can't explain, and it may as well be magic. And that's in a lot of science fiction. It may as the FTL drive, the thing for getting between star systems, may as well be magic, because we have only the vaguest concepts right now of how traveling to another star system and not taking less than a century could ever be possible.
Sure.
So I decided, well, screw it, let's make it magic. And then my brain, because my brain kind of insists on pulling back all of the details of it. By the time I'd finished the short story, I knew about Project Olympus and the genesis and how the mages had come into existence, or back into existence, and what exactly their historical status is, and the setting is intentionally left vague. But yeah, so by the time I'd pulled that together, it's like I had, basically when I wrote the short story, I pretty much had Damien and the broad strokes of the setting. By the time I'd written the novella, I had Damien, I had David Rice, I had a few other key characters that are in the novella. And I knew the basic structure of the Protectorate. I knew, like I said, Project Olympus, the Eugenesis War between Earth and Mars. And I knew roughly how the Protectorate was structured, with the core, the mid-worlds, the fringe, the unarcana worlds, and all of that. And it just sort of grew out from there. But it kind of started with the idea of FTL drives may as well be magic. Screw it. Let's make it magic.
Right. I love that. Just let it be what it is. Yeah. Let's stop trying to dress it up.
There is an actual pseudoscientific, let's call it, explanation as to how magic works in the Starships Mage universe. None of the characters know it, so it's never in the books, but it informs what they can do.
And it informs you as a writer.
I understand how the magic in Starships Mage works on a physics level.
Gotcha.
And that informs what they can and can't do.
So and we'll get back to the writing of this in just a second, but since you kind of hit on that, when you're developing a magic system, you have to have rules that even if your characters don't know them, you as the writer have to know them, because it gives you parameters to write within. Do I have that? Is that roughly?
If you don't have the parameters, if you don't know the limits of the magic system, then it's all too easy for magic to be the answer to everything.
Right.
Very rarely in the Starships Mage series is magic the pure answer to anything. It's actually one of the fundamental conceits of certainly the books around Damien Montgomery is this is a person who has all the political, magical, etc. power, and it is never the answer to his problem.
Love that. I love that. So back to we'll come back to magic systems in a minute, but back to the writing and publishing. 2014, did you say?
2014, yeah.
Okay, around that time, if I'm remembering right, the Kindle Revolution had come and made a huge impact on the publishing industry and writing in general, because now you could write a story and you had a place where you could publish it without going through the gatekeepers of publishing. And as a result of that, there were a number of authors, and I'm immediately thinking of Hugh Howey and Wool, maybe, that were putting out some of these books that were being published as a series of novellas, and then packaged together as an omnibus edition. And I can think of a number of projects that came out in that way. Were you familiar with them when you started thinking about?
That was very much where the structure of the Starships Mage novellas came from, following that trend.
I wonder.
There was a push.
It seemed like about the right time.
Yeah, there was a push in the author community at the time for basically for a rapid release of novellas.
Right.
I could not write a novella every 2 weeks then. I mean, theoretically could now if I was not trying to live my life. Right. But I could say one of the things I did then was I had a very steady schedule for that first year. It was like every 3 months on the 15th, here's a novella. So it was like you could set a calendar. Some people literally had calendar or reminders set up saying that on the 15th of September, there would be one of the Starships Mage novellas. So I tried to be very reliable for that first year when I couldn't produce much because I was still working full time.
Right. Right. When did you realize that you were gaining a readership? And what were some of the first feedback that you were getting from readers, and maybe what was it that fed you to think, this is maybe something that I at least am getting great joy from, and it seems like other people are too.
By episode 3 of Starships Mage, it sold several hundred copies in its first week, which, I mean, 99 cents and 35% royalty, that's not exactly anything to write home about in terms of money, but it was enough for me to go, this might actually get to the point of being an interesting side income stream. It's a hobby I've had for a while. I had at the time, I think, 3 or 4 novels that were out with an agent going through the traditional publishing route. But it was, so June of 2014, I guess pretty much 10 years ago now, I was looking at the numbers of the release of the third novella and going, this might actually be something to this. I was an accountant and always a little bit mercenary, so I was running out some numbers and like, how many would I actually need to sell to make a living at this? And the answer was more than seemed possible at the time, but we kept going.
Yeah.
And then I think it was really with episode 5 and the omnibus that things really sort of kicked over a tick, because up to that point, I'd been getting basically 30 cents a novella sale, which really doesn't, even in, quite significant numbers of novella sales, doesn't really add up to much. But the omnibus was $2.99, $3.99, I don't remember, but I was getting 70% of that.
I was about to say that bumps you up to the 70%. That's significant.
The first month of Starships Mage paid the down payment on the house I'm sitting in.
How about that?
That was the point at which I realized I had been struck by lightning.
Did you ever think, okay, I've done this, now can I repeat it?
Yes.
With the kind of brain that you have and the business that you had been in, did you start, concocting a strategy and coming up with a plan?
Yep. So I had spring of 2015, I had 3 novels published.
Okay. 1
had done fantastically well. 2 had kind of done the I had a 4th novel, Space Carrier Avalon, that I was working on, and I knew what the second Starships Mage novel was going to be. And I was working full time in a real estate development company and doing quite well there. And I published I published Space Carrier Avalon. And Space Carrier Avalon was a flash in the pan hit. Like, I knew, looking at what I'd made there, or at the sales we'd made and everything, that I could make at that point potentially more money writing than I could staying an accountant.
Wow.
But I was an accountant, so I was cautious and I was conservative, and we ran a bunch of things, and my partner and I talked things over, and I talked things over with my boss, and I actually went part-time at the company I was working at. They were very accommodating, very, very helpful. And about 2 weeks after I went part-time, we published Hand of Mars, and it became very, very clear I didn't need to be working part-time.
How about that?
I was basically given the choice. If I wanted to stay, I would have my boss's job. I would be making well over 6 figures. And I would have my feet solidly on the ladder to being vice president of finance or director of special projects somewhere inside of 3 to 4 years.
Wow.
Like, that was one path that was sitting in front of me. And the other path was I had 5 books published and had made the equivalent of my annual salary from those books. And I knew that if I stayed in industry, I would be able to write maybe 2 books a year. And if I left industry, I'd be able to write 4.
Wow.
And I basically said, I think I can make more money, and I will be more satisfied, and I'll be able to tell the stories that are stuck in my head if I go this route.
Yeah.
So I went that route. Yeah. And it turns out that I can write 8 books a year.
That was a great discovery, wasn't it?
And we have done quite well for ourselves over the last 10 years.
Nice.
I have written somewhere in the region of 80 books.
Wow, that's incredible. One thing that I find fascinating about your story is that that your day job initially gave you the ability to do this, even though that you graduated from that and now you write full time. But it was the solidity of that day job that gave you the ability to do this. And I think a lot of people that get bitten by the writing bug are just looking for, what can I do to get out of this day job to free me up to be able to do that. And it's, we don't look at it as the blessing that it is in a lot of cases.
Like, a lot of people's day jobs suck, let's be honest. But there is a very real value to the thing of, if you're going to quit and try and write full time, either have a solid stream already, or have 6 months income saved up, or preferably both. I did not have 6 months expenses. I'll make that clarification. 6 months of what it costs to live your life sitting in an account because it could go wrong.
Right.
I didn't. But I was also just had 3 knocked out of the park #1 space opera hits. My situation is not going to be most people's situation.
Right.
So.
Right.
And I lucked out, but in hindsight, I probably shouldn't have made the leap quite as dramatically as I did. It worked out for me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll say that it did. Do you classify the type of fiction that you write as, is space opera the best umbrella to
generally? Yeah. Like, I've written urban fantasy and regular fantasy and space fantasy separate from Starships Mage, which I tend to class as science fantasy. It's an interesting distinction that I have both a science fantasy series set in space and a space fantasy series, which has no science fiction to it whatsoever, but is in space.
I love it. There seems to be a dichotomy between indie published science fiction and science fantasy, and some of the traditionally published science fiction. a lot of the fun science fiction, and I'm sorry for picking. We have lots of friends in traditional publishing, and this is
Mhm.
not an indie versus trad discussion. It's just an observation. There
Yep.
seems to be way more fun happening on the indie side than there seems to be on the traditionally published side. Do you have any observations about that, and why the divide in science fiction there seems to be?
The biggest thing there, I think, there's a few things, but one of it is that there is, has been for a while, the attitude in a lot of gatekeeping isn't quite the right word, but it gets across what I'm after. In a lot of industries, you have people in a position to shape tastes and shape what's available even more than tastes are very much stuck in a mode of I don't want to see the same thing again. So you look at video game reviewers, and you can have a video game that is a well-told story with competently executed gameplay, but if it's the same gameplay that we've seen before, it will get it will get slagged in a lot of its reviews for it.
Right.
But you've also got a large chunk of the audience that is just looking for the same thing, the same thing or something similar, well told. Again, for lack of a better way to put it. And so in traditional publishing, you've got the editors and the acquirers, and they're looking for something new, something different. And they are often looking for something that has a bit more, they're looking for something with depth because that's what they've learned to value, and that there is a good chunk of the audience out there that values. And so they're looking for a relatively specific thing in a lot of ways. Where in indie SF, there's no one saying what we can or can't publish. So we just put up what we write, and the audience either buys it or they don't. And it turns out that a lot of people are really just looking for the same thing, well told and fun. Like, I don't necessarily, I am dismissing an entire chunk of the genre, including my own work here, with a brush that is not fair at all. But
Sure.
there is a lot of stuff that is still in a relatively narrow niche of space opera, military SF, and I'm as guilty of sticking to my niche as anyone else.
Sure.
And so we see that there is an audience that has an appetite for the same style, for multiple takes on the same basic concept, where traditional publishing has traditionally not gone for that. They've gone for there can be one David Weber military SF
Right.
with numbers and thought and historical analogs. There can be the one.
Right.
There is a David Weber and there is a John Scalzi, and these are two very different takes on what can still be theoretically called military science fiction.
Right.
And then in indie space, you've got, not to be mean to Jeff, but Jeff Chaney's entire wheelhouse of authors who are all writing in that in an even narrower shtick of military SF than David Weber on his own.
Right.
And let's be clear here, I've met Jeff, I've met Terry Mixon, I have met a good chunk of the top names writing under Chaney's label, and these are brilliant, brilliant gentlemen. Like, they're fantastic. I've got nothing against them, and I certainly am not talking down their work, because God knows the guys I'm talking about here are the guys I'm mostly reading.
Right. Yeah. And
also,
Jeff Chaney
John Razzie, I have met and can break me with one finger. So.
Yes. Yeah, I know him too. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
He wouldn't, but he could.
Right. Exactly. So when you published the Starships Mage, you packaged it together in an omnibus, and what did you follow that up with? You've got this, you start smelling some success, you start thinking, okay, I'm getting a readership here. What do you then decide to follow that up with? How do you continue this ball rolling?
I followed that up with 2 fantasy novels that I had already written.
Okay.
That I edited and released. One did okay, one did terribly. We've republished one since, and the other one is no longer available for sale. And then I wrote the other story that had been sitting in my head, which became Space Carrier Avalon, which was a more traditional military SF space fighters.
Yeah.
I quite like it, but I'm not going to pretend it's not traditional military SF space fighters.
Yeah.
You know, economic. It's me, so there's a lot more economics and politics in it than in some. But and then I followed up Space Carrier Avalon with Hand of Mars and Stellar Fox, the second Space Carrier Avalon book. And then I think that was the first two series. Terran Privateer was born out of an argument with Christopher Fox.
I love Chris Fox.
Chris had done his, right to market assessment of the market.
Right.
And he was like, well, all of these books have these strong male protagonists, so clearly that's what the audience want. And so then I went, well, to me, that tells me that there's no strong female protagonists other than Honor Harrington, which to me sounds more like a gap in the market to be served. So Chris went his way. I went my way. I'm pretty sure Duchy of Terra outsold his series.
Nice. Nice.
Because that was the Terran Privateer with Annette Bond as the strong female lead.
I love it. I love seeing how two different guys can look at the market and each say, well, I see it this way, but I see it this way. And
truthfully, neither of us was wrong.
I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Neither of us was wrong.
Exactly.
Because he wrote something that hit all the tropes of the market, and it did quite well. And I wrote something that looked at the tropes of the market and went, there is a gap here, and put a book right in that gap.
Right. I love it. I love it. That's there's a lesson in that. Your fantasy novels that you published.
Yes.
I've known quite a few indie authors that have tried to publish fantasy, more traditional fantasy, and it seems like that's much more of a slog than science fiction. Does that have to do, in your opinion, does that have to do with the way readers are positioned for whatever reason to like fantasy or not? Or does it have more to do with you were established as a science fiction author, and so the fantasy readers didn't know what to do with that? What do you make of that?
Fantasy outsells science fiction about 2 to 1. That's a lot of it. So if every one of my science fiction fans bought my book, which is bought a fantasy book which would not happen because they're reading me for science fiction, so they're not picking up, not very few of them are picking up a fantasy novel, I would still not rank in the top 10 of fantasy. Fantasy outsells science. The fantasy audience is that much larger and that disconnected that it simply just doesn't carry over. So if you're not hitting the fantasy audience with what the fantasy audience is looking for, and as a science fiction writer, you don't know what any of that is unless you go immerse yourself in fantasy the way I haven't done in 10 years at least. And so it's just that you're in a very different market. It's a market for quite different style of writing. It lends itself towards more ornate prose. It lends itself towards longer books. It lends itself towards slower burn and all of these things.
Right.
They're looking for a quite different style of book quite often. Urban fantasy, not so much.
Style of storytelling altogether.
But epic fantasy and traditional fantasy is a very different style of storytelling for a very different market. And it is a larger market, but it's also a market that's expecting longer, heavier books. That's where the Doorstopper was born.
Right.
And the Doorstopper ain't dead. So it is a market where traditional publishing does have a bit more of a hold still. It's a market, and it is a market where readers are looking for that deeper, heavier, darker thing than a lot of the indie authors have tried to pop up, and we try to write our popcorn stuff. And well, that's not really what the fantasy audience is looking for in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
So I have a couple of relatively successful urban fantasy series. I have a fantasy trilogy that we kickstarted one novel for and will eventually kickstart the second. It's been a bit of a pain trying to find the time to do that. It is a very different audience in a lot of ways. And for whatever reason, I don't think it's an audience that lends itself as well to the degree of analysis and deconstruction that it feels like got done to science fiction at one point. Just a tougher audience in general.
Yeah. And it's just a completely separate audience in a lot of cases.
It's not one I know. So where I write fantasy I enjoy. Sometimes it lands and sometimes it doesn't.
And if you have a dedicated readership for your science fiction books, they're not necessarily the dedicated readership for epic fantasy. It's not a one-to-one carryover necessarily. No. So Starships Mage began with this idea: if there's science we can't explain, it might as well be magic. Okay, well, if it's magic, let's make it magic. Okay, that's a great premise to start with, and you can come up with a novel based on that premise.
Mm-hmm.
But now there are 16 novels in this, where you have 18. Excuse me.
15 mainline, a side trilogy, and then 2 novellas.
Okay. So 18 stories that now you have extrapolated from that initial idea. After that first book, and you kind of established the world, and you've established some of the things that are possible, how do you continue to expand that world? And not just the world, but the storylines, the characters, how all of the tentacles of this reach out.
When I first finished the Starships Mage, the first 5, I had a trilogy in my head. I knew what the second and third book were going to be.
Okay.
The second book became books 2 and 3, Hand of Mars and Voice of Mars. The third book became the entire Unarcana Wars sequence, which was books 7 through 9. Book 4 and 5 basically would have been the prologue of the originally planned third book of the trilogy. And then everything after that was, well, these are the loose threads I left dangling around. Let's start pulling on some and see what happens.
Yeah. So when you have this many books in a series, how do you track it all? How do you track the way the universe has expanded, the characters that have branched off? Do you have a story Bible that you update? How do you manage all of this?
What was your name again?
Yeah.
I have I have a giant pile of disorganized Word documents and spreadsheets that are referencing each other, and that I reference back to. I've got a style guide that's updated by my copy editor that lists every character, world, term, etc. But a lot of it lives in my head, which is one reason why I'm kind of glad to end series. I am reducing the number of series I am actively writing right now, and that is necessary for my sanity.
Yeah.
The joke I made was, at one point I think I had 8 series going simultaneously, and I started forgetting my cat's names.
Yeah, I'll bet. What's a work day look like for you? Because you're writing, obviously, but you're also the publisher, and you're doing promotion. How do you segment?
A lot of the promotion, publishing, etc. is handled by my partner. I usually use the phrase "my personal professional partner." So they handle the publisher side of things. Right now, it's just them. We have had employees in the past, and they handle basically the process of putting together the paperbacks, the typography. We kind of bounce a bunch of the actual nitty gritty of uploading stuff to KDP back and forth between each other. Depending on the book, either they or I are handling the cover with the artist, that kind of thing. I do all the accounting, they do all the marketing. Their background is marketing and communication. So
seems like a pretty good relationship there that
yes.
you figured out how to.
They come from an entrepreneurial family. I don't. So us being in a very entrepreneurial business is kind of their fault.
That seems pretty beneficial. So were you hinting that this is the end of the Starships Mage series? Are you?
No, Starships Mage, I just kicked off a new arc. So that's going to be probably, if I know, for another 4 or 5 books at least just for that arc. And then whether there's an arc after that. And that's kind of, the arc I have just kicked off is kind of the final arc of what's been in my head so far. It would not be entirely out of the realm of possibility for some of those loose threads I've left scattered across the setting to get picked up. I think that we are looking at the end of the main Starships Mage series, probably around book 20 or so.
Okay.
But I have thought series were done before and been wrong.
Yeah, until another great idea comes up.
It's like I finished the Castle Federation series in like 2018 and then came back and wrote another trilogy in 2021.
Yeah, wow. So what does a typical production day look like for you?
Typically, I'm getting up, I'm making food, I'm sitting down on my computer, usually sometime between, usually trying to get to work around 11 a.m. I am not an early riser anymore. And generally it's working in, depending on the day, I work on various variations of the Pomodoro method.
Okay.
So currently I'm doing half hour on, half hour off. I have done 15 on, 5 off, 15 on, 5 off, 15 off, on, 15, 5 off, 15 on, 5 off, 25 off, starting again on the hour. I've done 15 on, 15 off. I rotate which method I am using depending on whether it's currently working for me or not. I am quite badly ADHD, as it turns out, so I find that no system works for me forever, and I need to change it up relatively often. I probably do for that again, given the struggle I've been having with the current book. And yeah, basically, I will write. The goal is about 3,500 words a day.
Okay.
If I can do 4,000 words a day, 6 days a week, I don't have to work the 7th. That doesn't happen very often.
Yeah. Do you consider yourself a planner or a pantser, or do you feel like those extremes don't necessarily work for you?
I write significantly faster with an outline.
Okay.
And I rarely look at my outlines past about chapter 10 of the book.
Okay.
I've written the outline, the book goes much faster.
But you've got all those kind of threads worked out.
Once I'm about 10, 15, maybe 20% of the way through the book, I stop referencing the outline. I'll usually have the outline open while I'm writing, but how often I reference it goes down significantly as the book progresses. And quite often, the final book doesn't really resemble the outline, except in the broadest of strokes.
When you're writing a book, are you thinking about the series follow-up? Are you leaving bread trails, breadcrumbs for yourself?
Sometimes intentionally and sometimes not. Because there's always going to be what Dennis McKiernan called red slippers.
Okay.
They're to provide depth to a setting and a story. There are always going to be things that are mentioned as having happened or as happening at that moment that aren't really part of the story you're telling. There's a whole bunch of things going on in various places in the Starships Mage setting that are not the story I'm telling. The story I'm telling is often quite focused. I don't know how far you are in the Starships Mage series, but there's one point where the main character basically sets up everything for a small war. The reader's never shown that war. She's not there. None of the main characters are there. That war is not the story that was being told.
Right.
And so but there is a whole sequence of events there. There are a lot of loose threads around the setting. Stuff gets mentioned that isn't part of the story. A setting starts feeling rather sterile if only the things that are directly relevant to the story are mentioned. Sorry, Chekhov.
Yeah.
Chekhov had to deal with the budget for the props that you could put on stage. I don't have to deal with the props budget.
True. When does having multiple series that you're writing help you to? Well, it obviously helps to. If you're writing a book and you kind of feel like I've exhausted the ideas for this, one thing that you can do is write something different, and then that original problem, they will nag you with new ideas while you're writing something else. That never fails. But does it help you to keep the ideas fresh?
I think so.
Yeah.
I write an entire book beginning to end. I don't really shuffle off and work on other projects at the same time. I've tried it. It didn't work very well for me. So I tried to write a superhero novel in my evenings. This is a superhero short story. I think that's 99 cents everywhere. That was the result. All I got out of that. But I tried to write a novel.
That's another thing that's been very difficult is the superhero genre has not translated well to the written word for some reason.
There is some really good stuff out there.
Yeah.
The one I quite liked was Wearing the Cape. It did. I kind of fell off reading it, but I think Marion G. Harmon was the author's name. Wearing the Cape was a really interesting take on a modern superhero world. But yeah, no, there have been some very good takes on it. It has not been as.
There's just not been a lot of it. Which is interesting.
My impression is there is some of it in the lit RPG space, but that's not a zone I really. It doesn't work for my brain.
Yeah, me either. That's a subgenre that I just don't get at all. It just I know there are lots of people that are loving it.
I understand its appeal, and dear God, people go enjoy what you enjoy. Do not let anyone tell you not to.
Exactly.
It doesn't work for me, but I do understand. I do tabletop RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons, etc., etc. There are dice behind me for a reason.
Right.
There's a reason they're in that case too. That set is very, very expensive. I could never quite bring myself to play with them. But I understand the appeal of it and how it works for people. I don't find it interesting myself, but that's me. And I would never begrudge, and I cannot begrudge the people who love it because I understand the appeal of it, even though it doesn't work for me.
Right. Absolutely. If you love something, love it. Don't.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be for everybody. Glynn, I feel like we just barely scratched the surface, and I could talk to you all night. There's so much to. So let's follow up at another time and discuss some more. But since we need to bring this to a close, if people are just discovering you and all the amazing things that you're up to, where's the best place to find you online and to dig into all that you've got?
My website, glynstewart.com. Or as I very often joke, if you can spell my first name, you can find me on Amazon. Glynn. There are no other Glynn Stewarts. It's not entirely true. There is like a doctor and a few other Glynn Stewarts, but there aren't any others on Amazon. Right. You type Glynn into Amazon, you get Glynn Stewart autofill in my experience.
Nice. Well, we'll put links in the show notes to make it easy so folks don't have to jump through all those.
glynstewart.com or my author page on Amazon are probably the best places to start. Okay. I mostly live at Glynn Stewart Author on Facebook or in the readers chat that's attached to that.
Great. We'll link up all of that to make it easier for folks to find you. Glynn, what's the new book? You have a recent release.
The new book that launched last Tuesday was Ambassador for Mars, which is Starships Mage 15.
Okay.
I think. Please tell me that's Starships Mage 15 and not Starships Mage 16. Sorry, I'm going to actually go check a file because I just had a panic moment.
I'm looking at Amazon right now.
15, yeah, it is Starships Mage 15.
Yes.
I had to set up the file for 16 for Chimera's Fall, and that's what was confusing me.
Yeah, well, Amazon says 16, and then I've flipped through, and because you've
But
got the
book
pre-order.
16, Chimera's Fall, is coming out in January. It's available for pre-order. Book 15, Ambassador for Mars, just came out this month. And we launched a new series, House Adamant, earlier this year with the Exodus Gambit, which is my current precious baby. Please go read it.
Yeah. Can you give us an elevator pitch for that new series?
Exodus Gambit is Game of Thrones styles courtly politics in a space opera setting. A young princess has her entire family wiped out and has to try and find allies to overthrow her favorite uncle, her mentor, who has murdered his family to take the throne, except for her.
Say less. I'm making a note now to go grab that from Amazon.
It is also It is a book I have described as a meditation on grief interrupted by explosions.
Love it. Love it. Glynn, this has been so much fun chatting. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. We're going to send everyone to see you and to pick up all your work.
Thank you.
Thanks.